An orc and her daughter, banished by their own clan, walked through the snow with nowhere to go. The cold was not merely a sensation, it was something that crept in slowly, settled into the bones, drained whatever strength remained without asking permission. Gritha knew this. She knew it by the stillness of Liska, who had stopped moving in her arms. But fate had other plans, and placed a solitary farmer in their path, a man who had no reason to save anyone, yet chose to save them both. The wind howled like a hungry creature over the borderlands of Grimvale. Snow fell in thick curtains, erasing everything, trails, rocks, any sign that the world still existed beyond the white. Gritha moved slowly, each step costing more than the last. Her feet sank into the snow up to her knee. Her arms, large and strong as tree trunks, held Liska against her chest with a firmness that did not match the exhaustion consuming every muscle in her body. The little one was no longer crying. That was what frightened Gritha the most. Liska had cried plenty at the start. She cried when the two of them left the clan's tent. She cried when the night closed around them like a mouth. She cried as the snow began falling heavier and the wind stripped the warmth from their bodies. But now she was quiet, curled against her mother, breathing with that slowness Gritha knew and feared, the silence of a child who is giving up. No. The word left Gritha's throat like a command, low and hoarse. Not yet. She pulled Liska tighter and kept walking. The small one's green skin had turned nearly grey from the cold. Her little pointed ears, which normally stood upright and curious, drooped to the sides. The tiny fingers gripping her mother's hide were stiff. Gritha felt them against her own body and pretended they were warm. She had lost her sense of direction hours ago. The storm had swallowed every landmark. The mountains to the north, the twisted pines that marked the edge of clan territory, even the stars Gritha always used to guide herself on open nights. Now there was only the white and the wind, and the growing feeling that she had been walking in circles without knowing it. Stopping meant death. Gritha knew this with the clarity of someone who had grown up on the cold edges of the world. The clan had taught her many things before casting her out, and one of the oldest lessons was this: in extreme cold, those who stop, sleep. Those who sleep do not wake. It was simple, it was cruel, it was true. So she did not stop. Her lungs burned with every breath. The frozen air entered like blades. The tattoos covering her shoulders and arms, marks of the Broken Fang clan, seemed to freeze along with her skin. She glanced at them for a moment, dark spirals against the jade green that now looked dulled by the snow, and felt something difficult to name. Anger, shame. A longing for a life that had existed and then been torn away. Liska whimpered softly. Gritha lifted her eyes immediately, sweeping the horizon of snow and wind and absolute whiteness. She searched for anything, a branch, a rock, any sign that something existed beyond that frozen emptiness. And then she saw it. Far enough away to be uncertain, almost erased by the curtain of snow, there was something dark, a shape, too straight to be a tree, too angular to be a rock. Gritha blinked. Afraid it was an illusion. She had heard stories of travelers who saw oases in the desert, houses in the snow, rivers in the middle of nowhere. The mind, when desperate, invented salvation. But the shape was still there. She pressed Liska against her chest, lowered her head against the wind, and began walking faster. Her heavy feet carved trenches in the snow. Her breath came out in white clouds. She did not know what that structure was, did not know who lived there, did not know whether she would be welcomed or cast out again. She only knew that Liska was growing too quiet, and that was enough to keep moving. But before we reach that distant structure, we must go back. 3 weeks earlier, when the snow was still thin and Liska still laughed. The clan leader's tent stood at the center of the Broken Fang camp, larger than all the others, decorated with animal skulls and bone chains that clinked in the wind. Gritha had not wanted to enter. She had stood at the entrance for a long moment, staring at those bones, feeling something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside, the air smelled of burning hide and old smoke. Torches cast orange shadows across the walls. War Chief Drogvan sat on a throne of lashed antlers, his massive frame draped in dark pelts. Beside him stood Koreth, Drogvan's son, younger and broader, with pale eyes that watched Gritha in a way that made her skin tighten. Drogvan spoke first. He said it slowly, as if offering something precious. Koreth had chosen her. She would become his companion. It was an honor. Those were the words the war chief used, honor, as though they erased everything else. Her grief, her loss. The husband she had buried only 2 moons ago, whose voice she still heard in the spaces between sleep and waking. Gritha said no. She did not say it loudly. She did not raise her voice or reach for a weapon. She simply looked at Drogvan and said no, and the word landed in the tent like a stone, dropped into still water. Ripples went outward. The warriors along the walls shifted. Koreth's pale eyes went hard. Drogvan's expression did not change. That was the worst part. He did not grow angry. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something that has broken and is no longer useful. And he decreed her banishment before she had time to speak another word. Disrespect to the clan, he called it. Outside, Liska was waiting. She was sitting on a flat stone near the fire, hugging a small carved totem, a wolf's head, a gift from her father. When she saw her mother's face, she stood up immediately, her little pointed ears rising, her green eyes wide and reading everything without being told. Gritha did not explain. She took Liska's hand and walked. The escort came quickly. 4 warriors who did not speak, who guided them to the edge of camp with the efficient coldness of people following orders. The bone chains at the entrance clinked as Gritha passed beneath them for the last time. She did not look back. She would not give Drogvan that. The night swallowed them whole. The snow began falling an hour later, light at first, then heavier, then relentless. Gritha had Liska on her back for the first stretch, moving fast, trying to put distance between them and the camp before the cold became dangerous. But Liska was not small anymore. She was 5 cycles old, growing, heavier than last season. And Gritha's arms were already aching before the first true night fell. They found shelter in a shallow rock overhang and stayed there until dawn, pressed together for warmth. Liska did not cry that night. She held her wolf totem tightly and watched the snow fall with large, serious eyes, and Gritha loved her so fiercely it felt like a wound. In the morning, they kept walking. The days blurred into each other, white sky, heavy snow, Liska growing quieter with each passing hour. Gritha counted her daughter's breaths in the night to make sure they kept coming. She bargained silently with whatever spirit still listened to a banished orc. Just one more day, just one more step, and then she saw the dark shape on the horizon and stopped bargaining and started running. She was perhaps 300 paces from the structure when the wolf appeared. It emerged from a cluster of snow-covered rocks to her left, moving low and slow, the way predators move when they are certain of their advantage. It was large, ribs visible beneath dull fur, which meant it was hungry, which meant it was dangerous. Its yellow eyes locked onto them with the flat attention of something that has already decided. Gritha stopped walking. She set Liska down carefully behind her, keeping her body between the wolf and her daughter. Her machete was at her hip, but her fingers were so numb she wasn't sure she could grip it properly. She flexed them once, twice, feeling the stiffness protest. She had fought wolves before. She had fought worse, but she had never done it while this exhausted, this cold, with this much at stake standing directly behind her. The wolf lowered its head and took one slow step forward. Gritha widened her stance. The shot came from somewhere to her right. It was sharp and clean. A single crack that split the silence of the storm and sent birds she hadn't noticed erupting from a nearby pine. The wolf dropped without a sound, its body collapsing sideways into the snow, steam rising from where it fell. Gritha spun toward the sound. A man stood perhaps 30 paces away, half obscured by the falling snow, a long rifle lowered in his hands. He wore a dark coat, dusted white at the shoulders, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He was not moving toward them. He was simply standing there, looking at them the way a person looks when they are uncertain what they are seeing but have already decided to act anyway. Then he took one step forward and spoke. His voice was calm, not soft. Calm. There was a difference. Soft meant gentle. Calm meant measured, deliberate, like someone who had learned to keep their voice steady because the alternative was worse. "Do you need help?" 4 words. Gritha stared at him. She had learned over a lifetime on the borderlands to read intent in posture, in the angle of a jaw, in where a person's eyes moved first. His eyes had gone to Liska immediately, not to Gritha's size, not to her green skin, not to the weapons at her belt, to the small child half hidden behind her mother's legs. Gritha said nothing for a long moment. Then Liska's fingers found the back of her mother's hand, cold and trembling, and that small pressure decided everything. Gritha gave one slow nod. The man turned toward the building and gestured with a tilt of his head. Not commanding, inviting. Gritha picked Liska up, settled the child against her chest, and followed him through the snow, watching his back the entire way, her free hand still close to her blade. The cabin door opened. Warmth spilled out like something alive. He stepped aside to let them in first, then followed, setting the rifle against the wall beside the door in a single practiced motion. He pulled off his hat and turned to face them in the firelight. He was lean and weathered in the way that men who spend most of their lives outdoors become. Not young, not old, with the kind of face that had stopped keeping track. "Brael," he said, touching his own chest briefly. Then he looked at the child and waited. Gritha glanced down at Liska. "Liska," the child said, her voice very small but clear. Brael nodded once, as if this was sufficient information, and moved to the fire. Gritha did not give her own name that first night. Brael did not ask for it. He moved around the cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to doing everything alone. He pulled a wool blanket from a chest near the wall and held it out toward Liska, not toward Gritha. Not stepping closer than necessary, Liska looked at the blanket, then at Brael, then at her mother. Gritha gave a small nod. The child reached out and took the blanket, wrapping it around her own shoulders with the serious concentration of someone performing an important task. Brael watched this without smiling, which somehow felt more respectful than smiling would have. He simply noted it, turned back to the fire, and hung a battered pot over the flames. The cabin was small, one main room with a stone hearth, a sleeping area curtained off at the back, shelves of tools and dried provisions along one wall, a single table with 2 mismatched chairs. There were no decorations, except for a faded rectangle on one wall where something had hung for a long time and then been removed. Gritha noticed it but said nothing. The broth Brael prepared was thin, dried strips of something, water, a handful of grains, but it was hot. He filled the smaller of 2 clay bowls and set it on the table's edge without pushing it toward them. Just placed it there within reach and moved away. Gritha sat Liska on the chair and let her hold the bowl herself. The child's fingers were still clumsy from the cold, but the warmth of the clay helped. She drank in small sips, watching Brael over the rim of the bowl. He was at the other end of the room, checking Liska's boots. He had removed them quietly to inspect for frostbite, his hands careful and unhurried. He found 2 of her smallest toes beginning to darken and began warming them between his palms without comment. Gritha watched him. She was sitting on the floor near the hearth, her back against the stone wall, close enough to act if she needed to. She told herself that was why she had not moved from that spot, readiness, but the fire was warm against her side, and her body was so exhausted it had started making decisions without her permission, leaning slightly into the heat, her grip on her blade loosening without her noticing. She did not trust him. That was a fact she held clearly in her mind, like a stone in a closed fist. She did not trust humans. She had reasons, old reasons, layered over years, confirmed in ways she did not want to revisit tonight. But she looked at Liska's color, slowly returning, at the pinched grey of her small face, softening into something closer to the child Gritha knew, and she understood that trust and necessity were not the same thing. She could be cautious and still accept warmth. She could watch him carefully and still let Liska sleep. Abrael finished with the child's feet, covered them with a dry cloth, and stood. He looked at Gritha once, a direct, even look, no more or less than necessary, and then moved to his curtained sleeping area without another word. He pulled the curtain closed behind him. "Gritha," she said quietly to the closed curtain. There was a pause. Then, from behind the curtain, "Gritha," just her name, repeated back, an acknowledgement, nothing more. She sat awake for a long time, listening to the storm push against the walls. Liska finished the broth, set the bowl down with both hands, and slid off the chair to curl up beside her mother near the fire. She was asleep before Gritha could say anything. Her small chest rose and fell with a steadiness that had been missing for days. Gritha rested her hand on the child's back and kept watch through the long, dark hours. The storm did not break for 4 days. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried, and the wind found every gap in the timber and made itself known with low, persistent whistling. Brael kept the fire going, with the routine calm of a man following a rhythm he had practiced for years, adding wood at specific intervals, banking the coals at night, clearing the chimney vent each morning before anything else. Gritha watched all of it. She was not comfortable exactly. Comfort felt too large a word for what she experienced in those first days. But the acute vigilance of the first night gradually became something quieter, a watchfulness rather than a readiness to fight. She still sat with her back against walls. She still tracked Brael's movements. She simply stopped needing to grip her blade every time he stood up. Liska was faster to change. Children, Gritha had observed, carried less history. They assessed each moment for what it was rather than measuring it against every moment that had come before. By the second day, Liska had moved from watching Brael from across the room to watching him from just a few feet away. By the third, she was sitting near the table while he worked, her wolf totem in her lap, following his hands with the focused attention she normally reserved for things she found deeply interesting. Brael seemed to know the difference between being watched and being studied. He didn't perform. He didn't narrate what he was doing or direct his actions toward the child for her benefit. He simply worked, repairing a leather strap, sharpening a blade, organizing dried provisions, and let Liska observe without making it a thing. On the afternoon of the 4th day, he sat at the table and took out a small piece of pale wood and a short-handled knife. He began carving in slow, deliberate strokes, turning the wood slightly between cuts, his eyes quiet and focused. Liska crept closer in stages, a few inches at a time, with the careful approach of someone who has learned that sudden movements change things. He didn't look up. By the time she was standing at the table's edge, he was finishing. He set the small carved shape on the table's corner, a sparrow, wings slightly lifted, its features simple but unmistakable. He did not hold it out to her. He did not say anything about it. He simply placed it there and went back to cleaning the knife. Liska looked at the sparrow for a long moment. Then she picked it up, held it against her chest alongside the wolf totem, and walked back to her spot near the hearth with both treasures pressed to her heart. Brael glanced toward Gritha once, just briefly, and nodded slightly before looking away. Gretha did not nod back, but something in the tight coil of her chest loosened by a fraction, and she let it. That night, Liska slept with both carvings in her hands, one from her father, one from a stranger who had not asked for anything in return. Gretha lay awake, looking at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about what it meant to receive something without conditions attached. In the clan, every gift carried weight. Every gesture had a cost tallied somewhere, to be collected later. She could not find Braille's cost. And that, more than anything else, was what unsettled her most. The snow began melting on the 5th day. Not quickly. The cold still pressed against the cabin walls at night, and the paths outside remained buried. But in the afternoons, a pale light came through the windows, and the dripping sound of ice loosening from the roof became constant background. The world outside was beginning to remember itself. Inside, something was also shifting, though more slowly and less noticeably. Gretha had started helping. It began practically. She was not a person who could sit idle, and the cabin's needs were visible and real. She replenished the firewood without being asked, stacking it with the methodical precision of someone who had been responsible for a camp's warmth before. She reinforced a weak section of wall where cold air was pushing through, using strips of hide from her pack pressed into the gaps. Small things, useful things, done without announcement. Braille noticed. He said nothing about it. On the 7th evening, he sat down across from her at the table for the first time. Liska was asleep near the fire, the sparrow carving tucked under her chin. The cabin was quiet, except for the fire and the occasional sound of something settling in the roof. He told her about his wife without preamble. Her name had been Kala. She had a talent for making things grow in difficult soil. She could coax green from ground that looked dead to everyone else. His son had been 4 cycles old. He liked to follow his mother through the garden and pretend to help, holding a stick like a tool, very serious about the whole affair. Braille had gone to town to trade surplus grain. The journey was 2 days out and 2 days back. He was gone 4 days total. He came back to smoke. The fire had already passed. What remained was the framework of what the house had been, some walls standing. Others collapsed inward. The garden Kala had tended reduced to ash. He found them inside. He stopped there. His voice did not break, which was the thing that made it unbearable. It simply stopped, the way a door closes on a room you are not going to enter again. Gretha sat with that silence for a long moment. She thought about her own husband, Vorath, whose laugh had been too loud and whose hands had been careful with small things. She thought about washing his body after the fever took him, braiding his hair the way he liked. She thought about how grief had not come all at once, but in pieces, surprising her at odd moments, in the middle of ordinary tasks. She thought about how Drogvan had turned that grief into a transaction. She did not tell Braille all of this, but she said, "The world took something from both of us." He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said. "It did." Neither of them spoke again for some time. He had stayed on the land, he explained quietly, because leaving felt like abandoning them a second time. That was all. He poured water into 2 cups and pushed one toward her, and they sat together in the firelight until the coals burned low. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers occupying the same space. It was the quieter, heavier kind, the kind that only exists between people who have shown each other something real and chosen to remain in the room anyway. By the 10th day, the main path from the cabin to the tree line had cleared enough to walk. Gretha stood in the doorway in the morning and looked at it. The snow was still deep on either side, but the center was passable, packed down by melt, firm enough to hold weight. She could see the forest beginning a quarter-mile out, the dark pines standing heavy and patient. Beyond them, she did not know what lay. She had never been in this part of the borderlands. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Behind her, Liska was awake and seated at the table, carefully feeding small bites of dried fruit to the carved sparrow, as though it required feeding. Braille was outside splitting wood, the steady rhythm of the axe audible through the walls. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and the dried herbs that hung from one of the ceiling beams. The night before, something had shifted in Greta in a way that the previous days had been building toward without her noticing. What Braille had shared about Kalla and his son, said plainly, without asking for anything in return, had made the cabin feel less like a stranger's space and more like a place where honest things were permitted. And so the night before, she had said something she had not planned to say. She told him that she sometimes thought she had deserved the banishment, that perhaps she had been too proud, too closed, and that if she had been different, softer, more agreeable, the clan might have found a way to keep her. Braille had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he did not offer comfort immediately. He looked at the fire for a moment, as if considering the weight of what she had said. Then he turned to her and spoke plainly. "You didn't deserve that. Not as a reassurance. Not as something said to make her feel better in the moment. He said it the way a person states something observable and true, the way you might say the snow is deep or the fire needs wood. A fact, plainly delivered. And because he said it plainly, it reached her in a way that comfort would not have. She had not responded that night. She had simply looked at him, and then looked back at the fire, and they had sat together until the coals burned low, but the words had stayed. She found them waiting for her each time she woke in the night. She turned them over the way she sometimes turned a smooth stone in her hand. Not searching for meaning, just feeling its weight. You didn't deserve that. She was still thinking about those words when she stepped back from the doorway now, on the 10th morning, and went to find him. Braille was coming around the side of the cabin, arms loaded with split wood. He stopped when he saw her face, and set the wood down on the pile without looking away from her. She told him directly, the way he had spoken to her. She said she did not want to leave. The wind moved between them. Snow dripped from the cabin roof in a slow, irregular rhythm. She held his gaze and waited because she had learned, slowly, over 10 days, that he thought before he spoke, and that waiting for him was worth it. He took one step forward. "Then stay," he said. 2 words. Just that. No conditions attached, no terms negotiated, no cost she could identify. Just an open door, offered as plainly as everything else he had given since the beginning. Greta breathed out slowly, and she stayed. Spring came to the borderlands of Grimvale the way it always did, reluctantly, in stages, as if the land was not entirely convinced the cold deserved to leave. First the ice on the window edges thinned and disappeared. Then the snow pulled back from the cabin walls, inch by inch, revealing the dark soil beneath, still hard, but no longer frozen solid. Then one morning Liska opened the front door and stood in the new light for a long moment, before turning back inside to report, with great seriousness, that she had seen a bird. Not carved wood, a real one. Life in the cabin found its shape. Braille taught Liska the names of the trees at the forest edge, taking her out each afternoon in the pale spring light. He didn't rush the lessons. He would stop at a single tree, let her look at it from every angle, put her hands on the bark, press her ear against it. Liska absorbed all of it with the same focused attention she had given the sparrow carving, total, unhurried, as if the information was going somewhere important and needed to arrive carefully. Greta watched them from the doorway sometimes, arms crossed, something moving quietly in her chest. She had begun working the land. The soil around the cabin had been abandoned for a long time, packed, depleted, woven through with old roots. She broke it up with a broad-headed tool she found in Braille's shed, working in the mornings when the air was still cool. It was hard, physical work, the kind she understood, the kind that required presence, that left no room for the mind to wander sideways into grief. She found she needed that. Braille noticed the turned soil one morning and came to stand beside her without speaking. She explained what she intended. She had learned to cultivate hardy root vegetables in cold ground during her years with the clan, plants that could take hold in difficult terrain. He listened, then he went to the shed and came back with seed packets he had stored and never planted, setting them on the broken ground between them. They planned the garden together. It was a small thing, and also not a small thing. Gretha understood this without needing to name it. She had spent her life in a clan where decisions about land and resources were made by rank, where her voice carried only as much weight as her position allowed. Here, Braille simply turned to her and asked what she thought, and waited for the answer and used it. Liska began drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, marking rows with the confidence of someone who had been making important decisions her whole life. They let her. Evenings became their own kind of ritual, the three of them at the table, the fire going, Liska usually asleep before long, the two adults talking sometimes, and sitting in comfortable quiet other times. Gretha found herself telling him things she hadn't spoken aloud in a long time. Small memories of Vorath, things Liska had done as an infant that had been funny before they became only bittersweet, parts of herself that had been packed away under the weight of survival. Braille received all of it without making it heavy. One night he mentioned that Calla had loved root vegetables particularly, that the garden she had kept was mostly things that grew underground, hidden and patient. He said it looking at the window, and Gretha understood that this was his way of placing something alongside what she had shared, not a comparison, just a parallel offered quietly. In the morning, Gretha found a small cleared space at the edge of the garden, separate from the main rows. She did not ask about it. She planted something there, a cutting she had carried from the borderlands, a hardy plant with dark leaves that bloomed briefly in late spring, something from her life growing beside something from his. Summer arrived without announcement. The pines at the forest edge filled out, dense and dark green, and the garden Gretha and Liska and Braille had planted together began pushing through the soil in slow, determined rows. The root vegetables came first, low, unpretentious, growing mostly underground as if still uncertain of their welcome. Then the others followed, reaching upward into the long light. Liska grew too, not dramatically, not in the way children sometimes seem to change overnight, but steadily, the way things grow when the conditions are right. Her green skin had returned to its full jade brightness. Her ears stood straight and alert again. She had stopped carrying her wolf totem at all times, which Gretha noticed without remarking on. It sat now on a shelf near her sleeping pallet, beside the carved sparrow, the two figures together. She ran between the cabin and the forest edge freely now, returning to report on birds and insects and the progress of various interesting holes in the ground that she was monitoring closely. Braille had taught her which plants were harmless and which to avoid. Gretha had taught her how to move quietly through the trees and how to read the direction of wind. She was learning from both of them without being told that was what was happening. The three of them had not spoken formally about what they were. There had been no declaration, no negotiation of terms. But the shape of their life together had become clear in the way shapes become clear gradually. You don't see the moment it happens, only the fact that it has. Gretha cooked 3 portions now without thinking about it. Braille built a second sleeping pallet against the wall for Liska so she didn't have to sleep on the floor. Small adjustments, accumulating into something solid. One evening in the long summer dusk, Gretha sat on the ground at the garden's edge, watching the sky go red over the borderlands. Braille came and sat nearby, not quite beside her, still that small, careful distance he had kept from the beginning, offering space before presence. Liska was somewhere in the tall grass, audible but not visible, conducting an investigation of some kind. Greta thought about the bone chains at the entrance to the Broken Fang camp. She thought about standing beneath them for the last time, not looking back. She had believed that night that everything good was behind her, that the future was only loss and cold and survival stripped down to its barest form. She'd not been able to imagine this. Warm ground, a garden with dark-leafed plants in one corner, a child's voice somewhere in the grass. She said none of this aloud, but Braille, who had become very good at reading the silences she kept, glanced at her once and looked back at the horizon. "Good summer," he said. Simple words, true ones. "Yes," Greta said. Liska emerged from the grass at the edge of the garden, holding something cupped carefully in both hands. She walked toward them with the grave intensity she brought to all important matters, stopped in front of them and opened her palms. A small, dark beetle sat in her hands, very still, catching the last light. "It's a good one," Liska announced. Braille leaned forward slightly to look. "It is." Greta looked at her daughter's face, lit by the evening, serious and bright and wholly unafraid, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more permanent than happiness. A sense of ground beneath her feet that would hold. Liska released the beetle into the garden and watched it disappear between the plants. Far to the north, beyond the tree line, beyond the snow that still held the highest peaks even in summer, a rider emerged from the shadows of the Broken Fang territory. He stopped at the edge of a ridge, his pale eyes, Koreth's pale eyes, scanning south toward the borderlands. He sat still for a long moment, watching the distant smoke rising from a small cabin chimney. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the dark. But he did not ride quickly, and he did not forget what he had seen. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orcbound Legacy.